Hey, we're gonna get started. Thanks everyone for coming to this week's edition of Road to the White House. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Dan Schnur, and I'm the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC. And we co-sponsor this lunch series through the course of the fall campaign with the Center for Communications Leadership over at Annenberg and the Bedrosian Institute for Public Policy over at the Price School. And when we at Unruh host these events, we co-sponsor them with the College Democrats, with the College Republicans, and with the Daily Trojan. And I'm joined today, as is always the case when we host, with a co-moderator from the Daily Trojan. Today I'm lucky to be joined by the Daily Trojan's news editor, Annalise Mantz, and Annalise is going to join me in questioning our panel today. Today's discussion is a little bit different than the ones that we've done in the past. Normally, when we take on these discussions, we focus on a particular policy matter that's being discussed in the campaign. We'll talk about healthcare, we'll talk about immigration, we'll talk about job creation. Today's discussion, as I think most of you know, is a little bit more broad-based. And we're going to talk about negative campaigning today, attack ads, and when they work and when they don't. And for this discussion, we've put together, I think, a really, really interesting panel. And I think you'll agree, as you hear them weigh in on this topic, just exactly how lucky we are to have them. So as is the case, each time we do this, we have representatives from our co-sponsoring organizations, from the College Democrats and the College Republicans. And sitting right next to me here is Taylor Markey, and Taylor is the social chair of the USC College Democrats. And sitting two down from her, we'll skip over you, Shallman, for now. Sitting two down from Taylor in the red, pink, I can't tell.
Salmon?
In the salmon shirt is the very tastefully dressed representative of the USC College Republicans, Barr Benyamin. Thanks to both Taylor and Barr for joining us here today. And then, as we always do for these discussions as well, we bring in two outside experts. And for this discussion, instead of bringing in a Republican and a Democratic political operative, what we thought we'd do, given the nature of this conversation, is to have one political campaign expert and one political campaign reporter, who's an expert also. But let me introduce them both to you. Sitting right next to Taylor here is John Shallman. And John is the president of Shallman Communications. And he's currently the chief strategist and senior consultant for the Wendy Gruhl for Mayor campaign of Los Angeles. And if past experience is any guide for those of you who want to work intern for Wendy Gruhl, John will be eager to talk to you after today's program is over. But in addition, John has represented winning campaigns for members of the Los Angeles City Council, the Los Angeles Unified School District, Los Angeles City Controller, the LA District Attorney, and any number of candidates for both legislative and congressional office around the state of California. And then finally, last but certainly not least, way down at the other end of the table, is Michael Finnegan. And Michael is one of the lead political reporters for the Los Angeles Times. He has been covering the Romney and Obama campaign from the campaign trail for the last few months. And he's back in Los Angeles for just a couple of days, and we're thrilled to have him to bring in his insights from the campaign trail. So join Annalise and me in welcoming and thanking all of our panelists for joining us here today.
Sure. I'd like to direct this first question to Michael. And in your point of view, what direction has both candidates taken so far in advertising, especially in negative ads in the campaign?
They've both been pretty harsh toward one another. I don't have the exact numbers on hand, but I know that Wesleyan University, they've done some studies showing that the negative ads outnumber the positive ads by a long shot. The thing we were talking about earlier that I was going to mention was that there's been kind of an imbalance in the negative advertising between the two of them because of a few things. The Obama campaign made a strategic decision from the get-go to go after Romney really hard on Bain Capital and his tax returns and things like that. And they were running these ads for about 3 months with no answer from the Romney campaign. which I think created a big problem for Romney because he wound up letting the Obama campaign define him in some of these states that didn't really know Romney all that well until they started seeing all this stuff. And the Romney campaign kept on going mainly with advertising that was kind of pounding Obama day after day on the economy and the deficit and things like that. And it was just harder for the Romney campaign to break through because Obama was so well known to everybody already. So I think that's a big part of the dynamic that's been at play.
Right. Thanks, Michael. Barr, we're going to come to you next. Barr, you interned at the Republican National Committee this summer and had a front row seat for some of this back and forth as it went on. As Michael talked about, over the summer at least, there was a significant imbalance, partially because Romney did not have the funds available until the Republican National Convention, partially, as Michael mentioned, because when you have a candidate as well known as an incumbent president, that those criticisms tend to have less impact. But I know you've had some thoughts in terms of the consistency of the two campaigns' messages. Maybe you can talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So with consistency, as Michael said, from day one, Obama's come out, the Obama campaign came out and made their message very clear in how they want to portray Mitt Romney, and have not really strayed from that. They've done it from day one. The Republican Party, they have their message where they try to attack on unemployment being over 8% for the past 40 months, the deficit going up, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, the message has not been consistent, just hitting Obama on that. A lot of times, based on the news of the week, the Republican Party or the Romney campaign or the RNC, whoever it is, will try to add that in as another little, but Obama also does this, and he also did this, and he also did this. So whereas the Obama campaign has just from day one said, this is how we're going to portray Mitt Romney, and we're going to stick to this message. I feel like a lot of times the Republican Party's message comes off a little bit as jumbled because you don't know what exactly they're going to be hitting on that week. Is it going to be unemployment? Is it going to be the deficit? Is it going to be some blunder that Obama made when he was giving a speech and went off teleprompter? So it's a lot harder to just stick in voters' minds, I think. So.
Okay, so moving to Taylor next. And speaking of the imbalance that has sort of persisted in some of these ads, how do you think that the impact of super PACs, especially since the Citizens United ruling, has changed this?
So I think that has intensified what Barr was just talking about. So the Obama campaign has somehow been able to be consistent with all of its super PACs. They have one message, but Mitt Romney's campaign, many of the super PACs ads are inconsistent, and it's sort of broken up his message amongst all of these different PACs that are making commercials and ads. So the other effect that the Citizens United decision has had on this campaign is that these ads can be sort of distanced from the candidate, and that allows them to be even more extreme. So we have like this polarization in the advertisements, and I think it alienates voters in the middle and makes them disillusioned with the political process, which is something else that is very important in this election.
Hey, John, I want to follow up on one of the points Taylor was making. And while she didn't use the word that I'm going to, she talked about voter backlash against a negative message. And my recollection is that over the years in politics, you have run a couple of negative campaign commercials.
No.
No? Okay.
We don't do such things.
Okay.
It's
But
awful.
but you know of people who have. Okay, so we'll start there.
I do.
Okay.
I do.
And what's interesting to me about this, and it gets to Taylor's point, is on one hand, a negative message is much more likely to be remembered by voters than a positive one, for all sorts of psychological reasons that I'm not capable of interpreting. Perhaps you are. Mm-hmm. But Taylor makes a really good point. Even if voters are more likely to remember a negative message, there's some backlash. They tend to think less of the person making the attack as well. And I'm wondering if you can talk as a strategist about how a campaign balances. On one hand, knowing that a negative message is more likely to stick, but on the other hand, that it might cause some harm to the candidate who's being seen as being overly critical and overly negative.
Mm-hmm. So, as everyone knows, negative campaigns have been around for a long time. You all haven't been around for a long time, but negative ads have been since probably the inception of our democracy. In the old days, a negative ad was actually worse because today we've got this incredible communication system. You know, imagine back in the 1800s when someone from one state would say, spread the rumor that a candidate running for president died. And so you can't vote for him, he's dead. And it would take someone to get on a horse to actually show the person in person that he's not dead, right? Now that's negative campaigning. Today, you've got really a situation with the internet where there's instantaneous communication. And the blogosphere has played an extraordinarily large role with the impact of negative ads and the backlash of negative ads. So to speak to that point, one of the challenges that we as consultants have is to try to express a negative ad without having people look at that and say, I hate the fact that that guy put that negative ad about that other guy. You don't want that. So what do you have to do to deal with it? Number one, you have to create validators. Validators are people, not the candidate, who's putting on the negative ad. You have to put people that folks, everyday folks, would trust. So for example, in the Bain capital ads that were being done against Mitt Romney, you had real workers who had been laid off, who's lost their jobs, who were speaking right to camera, saying, you know, I'm just an average Joe like you, and this guy came in and took my job away. That's pretty impactful, and it doesn't rub off the same way as a negative ad that you see clearly now, this is Barack Obama or this is Mitt Romney and I've approved this message, where they literally physically have to be on the commercial. Taylor brought up a really good point, which is the super PACs. Super PACs have the ability to spend, you know, at this point I think they're looking at it being close to $500 million. Michael, you may know better than I on these numbers. But $500 million on negative commercials that do not require either candidate to be in the ad. So they can run a negative ad, and it's not really attached to anybody. People can surmise where it's coming from or the support it's coming from. But it is absolutely true that when you run a negative ad, there is the prospects that people look at that ad. If it's not validated with third-party credible documentation, that people are going to say, this is just another political shenanigan. This is a dirty trick. I don't like it. I don't like the guy who put it out, and I'm going to vote against that person. That's what we worry about when we do those ads.
So based off that discussion of credibility in ads that you were just mentioning, I have a question for Barr. You know, you had this experience this summer working with the RNC, and I'm curious if you noticed the difference between emotional persuasion in ads or fact-based ads and their effects on voters.
Right. So at the RNC, I know that a lot of the ads that I worked on were, before we would come out with an ad, before we would even brainstorm an idea for an ad, we would have a fact-checking session, so to say, where we would actually research, see if what we were going to try to convey was a feasible message to convey in a realistic way. But of course you still want to appeal to emotions when you're making these ads, because a lot of times it's not even what you say, but it's how you say it that really affects the message. So I feel like to have a very effective ad, you definitely need to have some facts, or else it's going to get torn apart by the blogosphere and by the pundits on TV and analysts. But you also have to make sure that the way you're conveying the message is really going to tug at people's heartstrings and say, make them say, wow, this is an extremely convincing argument. It's based in fact, and it really affects my life personally. Because if it doesn't affect you, you're going to turn the TV off, and it's not going to really matter. So I would say you need to have both.
Michael, I'm going to come to you now to play off of one of Barr's points. Barr talked about the need of providing substantiating information in order to defend the ad against criticism. But of course, it's not always criticism from the opposition. The news media has attempted for many years now to play the role of somewhat of a referee, not only just in interpreting ads for voters, but telling them what's accurate, what's not, what's exaggerated, what's realistic, what's taken in context, what's out of context. I would think, and you tell me, I would think that would have to be a very frustrating role for the media to play. Because on one hand, we know from watching the NFL this year, nobody likes referees to begin with, especially Green Bay Packer fans like me. We don't like referees. On the other hand, you'll write an article saying that John Shallman's ad, okay, not Shallman's ad, because his are principled and truthful and beautiful, but John Shallman's opponent ad is nasty and misleading and out of context. And that article runs on the front page of the LA Times. And then that ad runs many, many times. Talk about the media's role as the arbiter in this discussion.
Well, it's sort of central to what we do to at least try to be an arbiter of the truth. And so we'll call out candidates for falsehoods and misleading statements all the time. The trouble lately is that we wind up, there's so much sort of opinion journalism now on television and in print and mostly on the internet that people kind of just choose their facts and they sort of decide what they want to believe based upon what their ideological point of view is. And so it's hard for us to kind of stay out of that realm and just be a straight referee. I mean, we continue to do what we do, but it's more challenging than it used to be to sort of keep from getting swept into the muck of the back and forth of the campaigns.
And of course, what smart campaign operatives will do, who are not quite as scrupulous as John, is what they will then do once Michael has judged my opponent's ad to be inaccurate, is I will run my own ad, saying, Los Angeles Times says that Smith's ad is a pack of lies. And then we drag you into the campaign even more.
Yes. Yeah. And the same campaigns will cite you in their ads and then just bash you like crazy for having, said something that they're unhappy with. So what can you do?
True.
So getting into that from a little bit of a different perspective, John, maybe it would be good to get your opinion on your experience working in political campaigns. How is the role of journalism as either a political referee or, in some cases can be seen as part of the political discussion? How does that impact advertising and advocacy for a candidate?
The media is an incredibly important role. And you'll watch tonight after the debates. Watch the respective operatives go after the media and spin them. Everyone knows about spin? Michael's been spun more than I'm sure he wants to recount. But the goal is to get to those reporters, get to them facts. You're going to see this like crazy tonight if you're watching the debates. They're going to say, he said this. This is the fact. It's wrong. You need to report it. We can say it. It's not credible because it's coming from our campaign. You need to report it so that whether it's the LA Times or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever, it's saying he lied, he misled voters, he, whatever. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of spin going on. That's our job. Our job is to be advocates, no different than attorneys. Our job is to be advocates and go to the jury, or at least someone is going to speak to the jury, ultimately the voters, and say, here's kind of what we saw tonight. These guys said some things that weren't truthful. These guys said some things that weren't truthful. Ultimately, the journalists, different from their editorial, will come down in certain ways. But a huge part of our game is how we play the media. It's an enormous part of what we do. And it's free, technically. You don't have to pay for ads.
And for those of you who decide that you prefer not to watch the post-debate media spin, just as a reminder, tonight we'll be hosting a viewing of the first presidential debate in the Annenberg East lobby. The debate starts at 6 and runs till 7:30. And from 7:30 until 8:30, we'll host a panel discussion talking about what we saw with both political experts and students. So we hope you'll join us in Annenberg this evening for the debate, for the conversation, and if I'm not mistaken, Chui, for pizza? Yes. So not necessarily in that order. Come for pizza, but we only give you pizza if you stay for the debate and the conversation. So it's up to you guys. Hey, Taylor, I want to come to you. And it's going back to something that Barr talked about a little bit earlier, is a lot of the negative messaging that we're seeing, particularly in this cycle, is focusing less on the policy differences between the candidates and seems to be more personal. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that trend and its impact.
Yeah, so it seems like there's been a trend in this election cycle to go back to these sort of ideas of like, is this a candidate that I would want to have a beer with? Is this a candidate that I would want to answer a phone call at 3 a.m.? Not a question of, is this a candidate who has policies that are going to help me? It's more about the personality of the individual. And the Obama campaign, as we said earlier, has done a great job of like painting Romney as having a specific personality, as somebody who doesn't care about poor people. And the Romney campaign has had more of a fragmented approach at painting Obama as something. Both of them have come out trying to make the other person seem weird or out of touch with the average American voter. And I guess it just like lends to the question about what kind of political discourse do we want? Do we want this kind of political discourse where it's about ad hominem attacks and it's about, you know, these individual characteristics of being weird or out of touch, or do we care about the policies?
Well, Taylor, I think, makes a great point. And if you look at these negative messages that are based more on the individual than on the policy, think about it as almost a preventative attack. In other words, if I know later in the campaign my opponent is going to tell you something about his or her policy on job creation or on education or on health care, I don't want you to believe what my opponent's going to tell you. So if I criticize her credibility at the beginning, say, no matter what Taylor Markey tells you, you shouldn't believe her because of this, this, and this, then when she does start to make her case on the issues that are important to you, you're more likely to dismiss her. Not because you disagree with her policy solution, but because I've convinced you that she's not a particularly trustworthy individual. Let's do this. As we do always halfway through, we switch this from a conversation that Annalise and I dominate to one in which all of you, or many of you at least, have the opportunity to weigh in with questions. And so if any of you have questions for any or all of our panelists, now's your opportunity. We'd love to have you weigh in. Just two reminders that I know many of you have heard from me before. Number one, when you ask a question, when we call on you, we ask that you tell us who you are, just so we know who's asking the question. And then second, in particularly, if you're going to pose a question toward a panelist with whom you disagree, we ask that you ask that question with the same degree of respect that you'd hope that they would show you if they were disagreeing with you on a point that you had made. So with that, who might have questions for our panel? Yes?
My name is Adrian. I'm a freshman, and this question's for Michael. They talked about the media being an impartial referee, but we've also heard a lot about the media kind of having a liberal bias. So, in your experience, what kind of role does that bias actually play in the coverage of political kind of discourse and competition, I guess? So, do you think that there actually is that bias in the media?
And Michael, let me follow up before you answer it, because I think it's a great question. I've heard two criticisms of the news media in this regard. I hear criticisms from Republicans and conservatives that the news media has a liberal bias. I hear criticisms from an increasing number of liberals and progressives that you guys are corporate tools because you're owned by major corporations and you're all about making money. Both, neither, one or the other. What's wrong with you?
I'm not a media critic, so I don't actually feel comfortable talking about the media at large. I can talk to you about the universe, the sort of smaller universe of people that I work among, being newspaper political writers, like major newspaper political writers, and now website, of course, also. But there's sort of an ethic to the profession of how to cover candidates and campaigns. It's important to be detached from what you're covering and to be able to listen carefully to both sides and give both sides a fair shot at communicating their point of view. At the same time, there's something irresponsible about just being a conveyor belt of information from both sides and say, here, you do whatever you want with it. Part of what we try to bring to the table are analytical skills. And when we're watching two competing campaigns go after each other, we want to try to explain why they're doing what they're doing, when they're doing it, what they hope to get out of it, what's the context, who, in the case of a political campaign, who exactly are the voters who are in play, and how can either side sort of go after whatever constituency they need to get to. And so when you apply whatever analytical skills you've built up over the years, just covering campaigns and watching how elections unfold, to a specific candidate in sort of the heat of the final weeks and months of a campaign, all you can do is just put it out there and hope for the best, and let the whole body of work speak for itself. If people want to make judgments, then they should, but hopefully they'll accept your standing as someone who's just abiding by the sort of practices of the profession.
But I'll tell me your name again. I apologize.
My name's Adrian.
Adrian, it's a great question, and it's one that is pervasive in all discussion about local and state and national politics. I just add 2 quick cents, taking moderator's prerogative on this one. I'd agree with most of what Michael said, with one exception. I think the media does have a bias, and I think that bias is not so much ideological, liberal or conservative, but rather it's a bias in favor of effective campaigns and against ineffective campaigns. When you've been watching campaigns doing things well and doing things poorly, I think the news media, consciously or not, tends to give more favorable coverage to a campaign that not ideologically but operationally is performing well. Isn't Smith's campaign wonderful? They did this and this and this and it worked really well. And they tend to be particularly harsh on a campaign, not because they're conservative or liberal, but because the strategies that they're employing have been ineffective. I don't know if...
I can see how coverage of if you're a reporter, covering a campaign that's collapsing is much more interesting than one that's just working like clockwork. And so we pay attention to a campaign.
It's more fun to cover UCLA football than USC football because they're collapsing, absolutely.
We do pay attention to stumbles and mistakes that campaigns and candidates make, for sure. From the outside, it can seem like, okay, well, therefore, you're sort of ideologically in tune with the opponent and beating up on the candidate. But I also think a lot of that is legitimate. Well, all of it is legitimate, material to work with. A candidate who's running a horrendous campaign, something people should know.
It's a lot of pressure on us.
It is. It's hard.
Can I comment on that real quick?
Oh, absolutely, John.
So, first of all, in terms of the bias issue, I think people, to some extent, news has become entertainment. If you are a liberal Democrat, it's unlikely you drove over here listening to Rush Limbaugh. If you're a conservative, it's unlikely you turn on Rachel Maddow and watch her every night. So the fact is, most people want to listen to people who are like-minded, and we see many more personalities in the media. Michael's, your great personality, but he plays it straight, just like he should. He's a reporter. He's going to cover it with all the ethics, without worrying about how many newspapers we're selling and the provocative nature of our headlines. He's going to focus on the facts, and that's what you expect and hope out of the coverage of reporters following the race that you're in the middle of working on. That said, there is tremendous desire on the parts of the MSNBCs and CNNs and Fox News to get viewership. How do you get viewership? You got to be provocative. You got to be interesting. You got to suck people in. And that whether it's talk radio, whether it's some of these news shows, people are going to say things that are incredibly biased. But we can't be really concerned in the campaigns about those folks. It's the legitimate, sort of non-biased media that's covering the day-to-day operations of a campaign, how they write about it, what sort of investigative journalism that they're using. And the fact of the matter it is, when a campaign does something bad, they're going to cover it. And it's up to me as a campaign consultant, if I'm on the bad side, to turn it around. I was involved in a congressional race, a very important, very well-watched congressional race in Orange County for Loretta Sanchez, who was running for the first time against a very conservative Republican in Orange County. Wasn't expected to win. We were doing exceptionally well, and we were getting very good coverage from the media who thought, this is interesting. It's kind of a good story. This young woman, female Democrat, Latina, running in a very ultra-conservative white Republican area is giving this guy a run for the money. That made it interesting, made it more sellable. When our candidate's husband got arrested about 2 weeks before the election, it's not something we as a campaign could control. It's something that happened. And so we had to take a circumstance that they had every right to write about and spin it and turn it and make it something that we could survive. We ended up surviving. It turned out he was arrested for stealing lawn signs of the other candidate. Not exactly a felony, but nonetheless embarrassing. And
at some point, we're going to have you back for a panel to talk about how you spin stealing lawn signs with your political opponent, but we'll leave that for another day.
Leave that.
Yes.
My name is Nathaniel Haas. I'm a freshman. Regarding the debates tonight, my question is for Mr. Shallman. Especially from the Romney campaign, we've heard a lot about his strategy practicing like these one-line zingers that the media is going to take and run with. So my question is twofold. First, do you think that that's a good direction for American politics? And second, do you think that sound bites from either candidate have the potential to affect the election based on the ads they campaign?
And I'll throw in a third question on top of that.
Sure.
John, when you prepare your candidates for debates, do you help them prepare one-liners or sound bites that you think are going to show up on the news?
Oh, sure. Listen, I think debates do matter. I really do, particularly close races. I think this is a close race. I think it matters. You can go back to early debates. First televised debate was Kennedy and Nixon. A lot of it becomes style over substance. It's how you look. It's how you react. It's how you deal. People, what voters are looking for, and again, we're talking about a very narrow sliver of voters. For the most part, the vast majority of people who are watching, many of you are here, have picked a side. And you're just hoping the other side screws up and your side doesn't. When you're celebrating when the other side screws up and you're excited when your side gets a zinger in there. But the vast majority of the focus tonight are going to be on that 5, 6, 7% of undecided voters in Ohio, in Florida, in Iowa, some of those swing states. That's who's really watching. And for the most part, what I have found traditionally is that those voters are independent. They're folks who are sitting around. They don't like either side hitting each other, attacking each other. They're not overtly partisan. They want to see government work. They want to see people getting along. Solve my problems, for crying out loud. I think what you'll see tonight is who's going to talk to that voter and how well they do. Zingers, they've worked. We've seen them in the past. You know, we can go back into. Well, I won't. You know, there's millions of them, but ultimately these races come down to who's looking right, who looks competent. You know, when George Bush, this is before most of you were born, George Bush in 1988 was running against Dukakis. He was looking at his watch in the middle of the debate. A simple thing as looking at his watch in the middle of a debate sent a message. I'm sorry, it was 92 against Bill Clinton. Sent the message that he was just not interested in these issues that were profoundly important. I will also say one last thing, is that you'll see both of them tonight try to make this a referendum on two things. Obama will try to make it a referendum on middle-class families and the disconnection that Mitt Romney has with middle-class families, the 47% comment. You'll see Mitt Romney making a referendum on the economy, on jobs. Do you feel better? Right now, the country has 40% thinks we're heading in the right track, 53% think we're heading in the wrong track. He wants to connect to those wrong track people. So yeah, you'll probably see a few pre-rehearsed zingers, but ultimately it's take a look at the style over just the substance. That's what people are going to be looking at.
And I think in just a minute, I think even though it's going in a slightly different direction than the conversation started, I think we want to bring in the student panelists and ask what they're looking for in the debate tonight. But before we do, real quick, Nathaniel, is just one other point that I'd offer you to back up what John was thinking. What we know from watching these things over the years is a soundbite, a zinger, a particularly dramatic confrontation will lead the news, and it'll win the news cycle. But it very rarely affects the overall direction of the campaign. So when one of the famous gaffes in presidential politics going back many years is when Gerald Ford was president. In his presidential debate, he said that the nation of Poland had never been under the domination of Eastern Europe. That wasn't true, and everyone ridiculed him for it. But Ford, who had been making up ground in the polls that continued to make up ground, it didn't slow him down, although he ultimately came up just short in that campaign. In 1988, when Dan Quayle and Lloyd Bentsen were debating the vice presidential debate, Lloyd Bentsen had a particularly scathing comeback at Quayle. Dan Quayle was a fairly young man running for vice president, and he talked about how he was older and had been in the Senate longer than John F. Kennedy. And it's funny, you watch Lloyd Bentsen, I'd encourage you guys to watch this on YouTube, Lloyd Bentsen and Dan Quayle vice presidential debate. This is why it's important to prepare candidates for debates. It was very clear that Lloyd Bentsen had studied Dan Quayle, and he knew that Dan Quayle frequently said, I've been in the Senate just as long as John F. Kennedy was. And as soon as Quayle started to make the point, he saw the smile start spreading on Lloyd Bentsen's face. And by the time Quayle finished making the comparison, Lloyd Bentsen knew exactly what he was going to say. He said, I knew John Kennedy, I worked with John Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator Quayle, you're no John Kennedy. It was a devastating hit, and it didn't do one single thing to help Bentsen or his running mate's campaign. So these sound bites, they win the day, they win the news cycle, but they very rarely change the outcome of the overall election. But since we're talking about the debates, we'll go first to Taylor and then to Barr. Taylor, what are you looking for tonight?
So I am hoping that I will finally get what we've been promised for a very long time, ever since the Paul Ryan pick, that this election discourse will finally be about substance and will be about the policy issues that are different between the two candidates. And you brought up that they're going to go and try to get those 5 and 6% in the middle, and I think that talking about these substantive issues is how they can get those people. If people watch the debate and it seems like partisan squabbling, and it seems like two people that can't go across the aisle and can't work with members of the other party, the people in the middle are going to disengage and not be interested in the election as much. There was an interesting study done where they showed people two political debates, one of which was very civil and one of which was more like what we normally have, and they were all independent voters, and people afterwards psychologically felt much more disengaged from the election when it was not a civil discourse. So that's what I'm looking for.
Barr, how about you? I know we're a little bit far afield from the original discussion point, but you'll be watching tonight. What are you looking for?
Absolutely. I'd really love to see Mitt Romney actually come out and give details as to his policies and what he wants to do. I know he's gotten a lot of flack for that. People always say, well, Mitt Romney's attacking Obama, but he's not saying what he's going to do to make things better. So I think today will be the first time that we hear some clear policy directions that he wants to take. So.
Other questions on negative campaigning, on debates, sports, movies? What kind of?
Hi, my name is Sydney Fishman. I'm a freshman, and my question is regarding the issues of the different directions that campaigns are taking based on the different parts of the electorate that they're focusing on, such as female voters or Hispanic voters, or you name it, anyone fits in any number of categories. And so my two-part question, I guess, is what are the different campaign strategies, and do you think that's effective and a good direction for our political atmosphere to take?
Michael, let's start with you on this one. Can you talk a little bit about the demographic targeting the two campaigns are doing? Obviously, in an event like tonight's debate, the candidates are talking to all voters, to the entire country. But there are particular demographic subgroups that are important to the campaigns. Maybe you could talk a little bit about who those priorities are for the two sides.
Sure. I mean, I'm a little more comfortable talking about who their constituencies are than.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know exactly. We'll kind of see tonight a little bit better exactly who they're targeting.
Who they have been speaking to until now. Who have been their demographic priorities?
Obama has worked really hard to keep the gender gap very wide. He's been running a whole track of television ads in the swing states that are targeted to women voters, about women's health issues, contraception, and all kinds of things. So that's very, very important for him to keep that as wide as possible, because Romney has an advantage among men, and he needs to keep that, but also needs to narrow the gender gap. So that's a huge one. Romney also needs to, I don't know whether immigration is going to come up tonight, I think it's mostly on the economy, but same thing, Obama's advantage among Latino voters, Romney really needs to bring that down a little bit. It's a little bit too high. If the Latino turnout is high, that could be devastating for Romney in Colorado and Nevada and Florida. And then Romney needs to be careful with older white conservatives. Medicare is a huge deal, and polls are suggesting that the debate that got set off by his selection of Paul Ryan as his running mate has not worked in his favor, and that Obama is better viewed by, I can't remember if it's by senior citizens or just by voters in general on Medicare, but it's a problem issue for Romney, so he needs to be really careful with older voters. And conservative voters, they didn't like him all that much during the primary. They voted for other candidates like Rick Santorum, and so he needs to, remind them that he stands for all kinds of things that they agree with, and that's key to him, to keep them in there, but without turning off moderate voters. And that's
John, let me, go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, so to respond to the part of your question about is that the direction that we want our political discourse to be going, I think it's interesting to see that basically the ads have this sort of tone that if you're a member of that group, if you're a Hispanic voter, or if you're a Latino voter, or if you're a woman, you must agree with the message in the ad. You must feel that immigration is the issue that you're voting on, and that's going to determine who you vote for. And you must feel that contraception is your issue if you're a woman. And it's sort of condescending to those groups in some ways, and you see this from both of the campaigns. And both of the campaigns have been kind of distorting what the other person believes about those issues. The Obama campaign has mischaracterized Romney's views on abortion, and the Romney campaign has mischaracterized the way that Obama's policies will affect women. And so there's just a lot that I think that it's not the way that we want our political discourse to be going, this slicing up of people into their demographics.
John, let me ask you to weigh in on the same point. Is this type of, the term of art is micro-targeting and directing different messages to different voter blocks. Is this misleading? Is this patronizing? Or is this simply a necessary way of developing a winning coalition? Or is it all three of those things?
I'm really going to talk Taylor out of politics here. With just completely cynical, jaded, reality. The reality is that demographically, voters have different perceptions of issues. And, there is you brought up a really good point. You focus on two demographics that are scaring the heck out of Republicans right now. The gender gap. Women are leading. The most recent poll shows Obama is leading with women 56 to 40. That's a 16-point gender gap. That's a real serious problem. A few years back, we used to hear about soccer moms. The women that he's really lost is what they're now referring, I don't love it, but waitress moms, which are sort of the non-college, middle to lower class, working class folks in some of the key swing areas of Ohio and so on, where Romney's really lost. And to some extent, a lot of people blame that to the 47% comment, more than the women issues. And so it's that disconnection. And secondly, the Latino, poll today I saw 71 to 21, Obama over Romney. That's a number they can't live with. And they're obviously going to need to, for these last 4.5 weeks, go out and try to deal with those issues. The fact of the matter is that we do target demographically. We do target that way. I don't think, to be honest, Latino voters are strictly, I just know this is true. Latino voters are not singularly focused on Latino issues. They care about healthcare, they care about education, they care about jobs. And so to the extent that you're connecting with Latino voters, or all voters on those key issues, are important. The problem that Romney has is that he had a Republican primary. Barack Obama did not have a Democratic primary. In a Republican primary, you are appealing to a more conservative base of voters that are ultimately going to determine whether or not he was going to be the nominee. He was required, in order to win, for example, to take on Governor Rick Perry in Texas for being soft on immigration. He was being defined early on as someone that Latinos may have looked at Maybe they agreed on immigration issues. There are a lot of Latinos who have just as strong feelings about immigration, but the tone is problematic. The scapegoating is problematic. And so Romney had to sort of escape some of that definition that was, sort of formed in that hardcore Republican primary. The race becomes a race to the middle, to get to that centrist, middle, independent voter. And to be honest, demographically, they all care about fundamentally the same things. If you talk to a woman, a Latino, a man, affluent, not affluent, care about jobs, they care about the economy, they care about healthcare, they care about Medicare and Social Security. And you're really going to see that tonight, I expect.
We've got time for one last question, so why don't we go to you here because you look particularly enthusiastic.
I'm Drew Schmidt, and I find that last comment very interesting. If it's a race to the middle, there seems to be a disconnect between party nomination and then the presidential election. Do you think that the U.S. will ever move towards centrism as a beginning, as a fundamental, in order to start with the independents and move outward? Because in Europe, conservative means a very different thing than conservative means here. Do you think there's a broader direction in American politics with that movement?
Okay, I don't want to dominate this. I want you guys to talk. But in California, I'll speak to this. California made an effort to pass some laws to try to create more centrism. They passed a system of open primaries. I don't know if you're all familiar with open primaries, but it allows Republicans to vote for Democrats and Democrats to vote for Republicans and independents to vote for either one they want in a primary. So it requires Democrats who want to appeal to Republicans to be more moderate and vice versa. There was also redistricting that happened this last year. So those two combination of things created more moderate districts. We now have open primaries. So what happened in California, I'm not sure it can happen in other states, short of them passing their own legislation. But if they did, you would probably see a move to the center. We don't see that now in Republican-Democratic primary. We don't see it, Republican primaries. We don't see it in Democratic primaries. You see this move to try to secure your core left or right, and then the general election becomes a race to the center. What I think Republicans have done recently with the choice of Ryan and the choice of Sarah Palin was to say, you know what, we're not going to move to the center. We're just going to activate our base and get them to turn out and vote. We're going to energize them, activate them, and that's going to be enough. It wasn't enough in 2008. I don't think it's enough this time around. But perhaps our more centrist person here, our moderator, might want to talk about that.
Well, as luck would have it, we're just about out of time.
Sorry.
So what I'll offer briefly is that I think John makes an excellent point. Years and years ago, I had a boss who said, "There's no such thing as a raging moderate," and inevitably, a lot of the political energy that exists at all levels of elections tends to come from the bases of the two parties because those individuals generally tend to be more impassioned, almost by definition. But I think John makes an excellent series of points, which is the types of reforms you've seen in California are designed to give voters and candidates who do trend toward the center more of an opportunity than currently exists. In my own brief editorial comment is I think that can't help but to be a good thing for the system, not because moderates are inherently superior or inferior to principled liberals or conservatives, but if after an election's over, you want the two parties to work together to get things done, it helps to have some people between the 40-yard lines who can help foster that conversation. All that said, we have wandered just a bit from our original conversation of negative campaigning, but I think you guys would all agree with me that the conversation took not only unexpected but very, very interesting turns. So join me in thanking our panelists. Join me in thanking Taylor Markey, John Shallman, Barr Benyamin, and Michael Finnegan for an excellent conversation. Join me as well in thanking Annalise Mantz and our partners at the Daily Trojan for their work on these lunch panel discussions. Our partners at the Bedrosian Center and at the Center for Communications Leadership for co-sponsoring these programs with us. And by the way, next week, the Bedrosian Center will be hosting a conversation called No Policy Left Behind, K through 12 Education in the 2012 election. That'll be 1 week from today, 11:30 food, noon discussion in this room. Also, just as a reminder, as I said earlier, tonight in the Annenberg East lobby, we'll be gathering to watch the debate with the panel discussion afterwards. And know that next Thursday night, October 11th, we'll be gathering to watch the vice presidential debate starting at 6 p.m. In the Rosen Family Screening Room right down the hall here in the Student Center. And then finally, in addition to everyone else we've thanked, let me thank Chui Huyn, Kirsten Olson, Adrena Hidalgo, Laura Hill, and all the student workers at the Unruh Institute for all the work they do each week to make these programs come off as well as they do. Guys, thank you very much. And finally, thank all of you for joining us for today's conversation. We'll hope to see you tonight for the presidential debate.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.